Good afternoon, and a warm welcome to STL's Annual Conference 2020. This year, due to obvious reasons, on Zoom. My name is Britt Tollefsen, and I am the chair of the Council for Religious and Lifestyles Community, STL, bringing together 15 religions and lifestyles communities. Today's topic is Vandalism in the Name of God. Religions have produced exquisite art and architecture, but enormous amounts of cultural treasures have also been destroyed in the name of religions and over the centuries. What causes it? I hope you will enjoy our 2 hours together. And by this note, let me introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Karima Benounne.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. Hello, hi, greetings to all of you. It's really wonderful to be with you in this digital cultural space to discuss this very timely topic of vandalism in the name of God, to use the title of our event. And I wanted to dedicate my remarks on this topic to the memory of Mohammed El-Sayani. And I start with Mr. El-Sayani today because I think his memory reminds us of all those who work around the world, sometimes at risk of their lives, to preserve the cultural heritage of the past so that we all may learn from it. Indeed, I am pleased to have the opportunity to return to this topic of the destruction of cultural heritage in light of events in 2020. A human rights approach to heritage was one of the first issues I took up when I assumed the UN's cultural rights mandate in November 2015, following the destructions of historic temples at Palmyra and mausoleums in Mali, in that case by Muslim fundamentalist groups that rejected the histories and cultural practices that those sites represented. In 2016, I prepared 2 reports on this topic for the UN Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly. And then in 2017, I served as an expert for the International Criminal Court at the reparations phase in the case of Ahmed El-Faki El-Mahdi, the first international prosecution for the standalone crime of heritage destruction. So I have to say the lens through which I look at these issues is really shaped by these experiences. What I'd like to do is to make a few general observations about cultural heritage to start with, and then try to apply that framework to the more recent experience. So cultural heritage is significant in the present, both as a message from the past and as a pathway to the future. Of course, I hasten to mention that those messages may be positive or they can be negative. They may be ambiguous, and indeed they can be interpreted in many different ways. Viewed from a human rights perspective, cultural heritage is important not only in itself, but also in relation to its human dimension, how human beings interact with the heritage. Cultural heritage, of course, includes both tangible heritage, which I will mainly be talking about today, such as statues and monuments and sites, but also intangible heritage, such as traditions and practices. The right of access to and enjoyment of all of this cultural heritage forms a part of international human rights law, finding its legal basis in a number of rights, but in particular in the right to take part in cultural life, which is at the heart of my mandate. Cultural heritage is a fundamental resource for other human rights also, in particular, the rights to freedom of expression, the right to education, and the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and belief. In its resolution 3320 of 2016 on cultural rights and the protection of cultural heritage, the UN Human Rights Council agreed that the destruction of or damage to cultural heritage may have a detrimental and irreversible impact on the enjoyment of cultural rights. In my 2016 report to the General Assembly, I gave examples of what were then recent acts of destruction which deeply affected local populations. And just to mention a few, the destruction of the heritage of the Baha'i minority in Iran, the destruction of mosques and churches in India, just to select a few examples. Unfortunately, there are many more. There is a long human history of such acts in all regions of the world, whether in wars, revolutions, or waves of repression, or indeed other contexts. Such acts of deliberate destruction that I identified in my report were often also accompanied by other grave assaults on human dignity and human rights in the same context. And I argued that they had to be addressed in the context of holistic strategies for the promotion of human rights. So again, recognizing the connection between people and their rights and cultural heritage. Acts of intentional destruction, I noted, harm everyone, but they often disproportionately affect people belonging to minorities. They tend to contribute to intolerance and tensions between people and to deprive all humanity of the diversity of heritage. Now, one of the things I noted in the report back in 2016 is that some of the violations, some of the acts of destruction have received the international attention they deserve, such as those in Palmyra. However, I also noted that many ongoing acts of destruction go unnoticed by the international community, such as those targeting, in particular, indigenous peoples. And one of the points I tried to make is we needed to use that so-called Palmyra moment to try to shine the light on other patterns of past or current heritage destruction, which also constitute human rights violations. And I recalled the grievous history of really the systematic destruction of diverse forms of indigenous cultural heritage in many parts of the world as a systematic part of colonialism, but also sometimes of nationalist policies in post-colonial states. And I noted that that has had long-lasting effects on the human rights of many in diverse geographical contexts. My ultimate conclusion in that work in 2016 and 2017 was that in responding to the intentional destruction of cultural heritage, it is critical to employ a human rights approach. So we're not just talking about preserving and safeguarding objects. We are taking into account the rights of individuals and populations in relation to those objects, in relation to that heritage. This then brings us to 2020, a very different moment. So what does any of this mean in the context of acts of heritage destruction or damage that have allegedly been undertaken in the name of human rights or due to the perceived or actual negative human rights meaning associated with the cultural heritage in question? This is a very difficult and complicated issue. So just to recap some of the events of this year in this regard, as protests against racism followed the horrific killing of George Floyd by police in the United States in May, around the US and globally, sporadic acts of cultural heritage destruction accompanying some of the protests took aim first at statues and monuments clearly associated with the atrocities of slavery, segregation, and colonialism. However, those acts had ripple effects, both nationally and internationally, and they began to be replicated elsewhere, targeting a broad variety of monuments for destruction and damage. And I can just give a few examples. For example, targeting the statues of historical figures such as US Presidents Washington and Lincoln. This happened again just in the last few weeks over the US holiday of Thanksgiving, but also attacks on monuments to murdered police officers, to emergency responders, to those who fell in the Second World War, to statues of Winston Churchill, who was, of course, both a notorious advocate of colonialism, but also a figure deeply associated with the defeat of fascism during the Second World War, and even Mahatma Gandhi. Monument activism, as it was called, was by no means confined to Europe and the US and was also experienced in other parts of the world, notably in Chile, Argentina, Mexico, often with the involvement of indigenous groups. And for example, in Venezuela, where Hugo Chavez tried Columbus symbolically and sentenced Columbus to having his statue removed. Perhaps the most highly publicized act internationally was the forcible removal of the statue of the slave trader and merchant Edward Colston in Bristol, England, which was thrown in the river, as we all know. There was then a much less well-known, terrible act of retaliation for that, with the only statue of a Black person in the city of Bristol, that of Jamaican poet and actor Alfred Fagan, being covered with a corrosive substance, so a retaliation against his statue. Then there were some clear errors that were made, such as when anti-racist protesters in Boston damaged the Robert Gould Shaw and the 54th Regiment Memorial in the city of Boston in the US, which is a sculpture dedicated to the African-American soldiers who fought in the Civil War. The Washington Post reported on another incident, the unexplained destruction in June of the statue of Hans Christian Hague, a Norwegian immigrant and US Civil War hero who fought in the Union Army during the American Civil War against slavery and against the Confederacy. This statue was inexplicably dismembered and dumped into a nearby lake by protesters in Madison, Wisconsin in June. Moreover, I have received reports from human rights defenders from around the world, for example, of Hindu fundamentalists in India, claiming that these incidents of destruction are justifications for their hopes to demolish Muslim sites in India. And in Algeria, where I in part grew up, Salafists, fundamentalists, used this moment to vandalize a statue from the colonial era of a woman with her breasts bared. So where then does the war of the monuments end? And who decides what vestiges of the past are legitimately preserved and how? And what is the human rights meaning of all of this? There's an additional fact to consider here, which is that sometimes this sort of symbolic war, as it were, led to actual violence against people, which is always of greater concern in human rights terms. For example, a far-right counter-protester shot and injured a protester in Albuquerque, New Mexico in the United States in June, who was demanding the removal of a particular statue. There were also, admittedly, some positive outcomes from the resulting new focus on controversial heritage, such as the United States House of Representatives approving legislation to remove statues honoring those who were part of the Confederacy during the Civil War from the United States Capitol back in July. This is, of course, something that should have happened long ago before people had to topple statues. However, I note, and this is a very important point, that Representative Jim Clyburn of South Carolina, the top-ranking African-American in the House Democratic Caucus, who had argued for this removal of these Confederate statues from the US Capitol due to their symbolism, he also said that he disagreed with those who were tearing down statues around the country, and instead said that these statues should be preserved to give them proper perspective in museums. According to the US National Public Radio, about 60 Confederate monuments have come down since then across the United States amid a national reckoning on race that is, of course, long overdue. But nearly half as many localities that considered removing their statues also decided to keep them. So one might ask, in light of all of this, is there anything that offensive monuments that glorify past violators of human rights can teach us? And I think of the very interesting example of Grūtas Park in Lithuania, which displays more than 80 statues that communists installed across that country during the Soviet era, and does so specifically as a way of teaching visitors and future generations about the wounds that many experienced in that era. The journalist Dirk Olin argued that if set in a thoughtful academic context, an American iteration of Grūtas Park could provide a powerful historical education for citizens and visitors. And I think this is an interesting model to consider globally as well. But this issue is very tricky. It's not easy. I also note the concerns expressed by some Belgian curators that if statues of King Leopold were removed in Belgium due to his ghastly human rights record in Central Africa, and those statues were placed in museums. Those curators feared that those sites could become really sort of troubling locations of pilgrimages for the far right and supporters of the late king, which also has human rights implications that have to be considered. So none of this is simple. We have to think creatively. In view of the recent protests and incidents involving vandalism of cultural heritage in many countries, it seems to me essential then that public authorities at all levels around the world conduct studies and surveys of the cultural heritage and the monuments displayed in their public spaces as a matter of priority, so as to assess the ongoing compatibility of these monuments and their public display with human rights, and to promptly take human rights respecting action to respond to the findings. This could be considered a sort of truth and reconciliation commission for monuments, as it were. And I note that the City of London in the UK is already undertaking such a process under the leadership of its Tackling Racism Task Force. The task force co-chair said, "We know that historical symbols continue to have an impact today, and we want to understand how people feel about this aspect of our cultural history and whether such landmarks should be recited, reinterpreted, or retained as they stand." Democratic negotiation with relevant governments to consider the peaceful removal of, or replacement of, or adjunct to monuments directly and specifically related to glorifying or celebrating slavery, violent racism, and colonization is an essential part of the response to the protests of 2020. However, and again, it's not simple. As one expert I consulted noted, it is also a double-edged sword, he said. Some political groups may consider even the most innocuous figure a violation. So we also have to maintain our commitments to freedom of expression and recognize that while glorification of past human rights abuses, including through monuments, has negative human rights effects which must be addressed, there is not a human right to not be offended. So that's, I think, an important distinction. In any case, any such review processes should involve thorough consultation and participation of all those having diverse relationships with such monuments. Another expert I consulted back in the summer, an archaeologist, emphasized the importance of focusing not just on objects, but on the related social processes. This raises, I think, a number of questions. Who decides what is displayed in public spaces? Are there multiple interpretations of heritage? Another expert and anti-racist activist that I spoke with stressed that the meanings of cultural heritage change, just like cultures and cultural histories more broadly, and cultural heritage can be deeply contested. In his view, those heritages and histories need widespread democratic discussion and negotiation rather than violence, precisely because symbols have many meanings and many emotional investments. Hence, I personally think it is very important that protesters find alternative means to express what may be very legitimate grievances related to human rights violations and histories of abuse that do not involve the destruction or the damaging of cultural heritage sites and monuments. Even those objects that do or that they believe do have problematic associations and even profoundly offensive meanings. While sympathizing deeply with the underlying motives expressed by some of 2020's iconoclasts, such as protesting against histories of slavery, systematic racial discrimination, and colonialism, all of which have had gross human rights consequences, such acts of destruction and vandalism may also have negative consequences for human rights, including cultural rights, the right to freedom of expression, the right to education, including the right to learn about history. In fact, the destruction or simple removal of problematic heritage, especially when done unilaterally, can also cover up the grave error of the ongoing memorialization and glorification of those who have participated in past human rights abuses, which itself needs to be addressed and understood. Some other figures depicted who have been attacked may have a decidedly mixed record, including both great achievements and great harms. And understanding this complexity of being human has perhaps never been more needed than now. Personally, I agree with the Brazilian historian Laurentino Gomes, an expert on slavery, who opposed the toppling of statues in his country, saying, "Statues, buildings, palaces, and other monuments are part of our historical heritage. They should be preserved as objects for study and reflection." I think it's very important to consider alternative measures to address legitimate concerns about the human rights impact of certain negative aspects of cultural heritage, such as possible removals from public display after a democratic decision to do so, or ongoing or altered display, perhaps in a more appropriate forum, such as a museum, with provision of additional commentary about the meaning of the objects, including from diverse perspectives. I think it's also critical to foster debates and discussion like this one today, or to contemplate very interesting creative use of cultural heritage that does not involve its destruction or damage by social movements, such as the wonderful projection of the image of George Floyd onto the statue of the Confederate General Robert E. Lee during a demonstration in Richmond, Virginia in June. So the message was made without damage to the underlying object. Artists have also suggested the possibility of adding works of art to what are considered problematic heritage sites or monuments to depict protest against them. Another possibility, of course, is to add new heritage sites and monuments to reflect the histories about which people are protesting now. For example, the French Ministry of Culture recently commissioned a Paris memorial to victims of slavery, which will stand in the Tuileries Garden. So I think a nuanced approach, even in these unnuanced times, is critically important. I do want to say that I think that footage of the toppling and smashing of statues or of their drowning, defacing, or decapitation, whatever the motivation, recalls many negative images and events which have shocked the world, and the tactics that have been used by some with anti-rights agendas, and unfortunately may create precedents for acquiescing to the destruction of heritage deemed problematic in other contexts, sometimes with illegitimate motivation, and sometimes which does not seek to enhance human rights. As such, it is troubling, even when the monuments in question may depict figures whose own actions were beyond the pale and deserving of the strongest condemnation. As one expert asked me, he said, the historical examples of the greatest such destruction have been undertaken by right-wing religious and racist supremacist groups. Is this what the human rights movement wants to emulate and stand for? And I think that's a very good question. At the same time, I must stress that I am entirely aware that such violent action against monuments today is in part occurring because of insufficient efforts and sometimes total failure on the part of authorities in many places to address and reassess the problematic cultural heritage that may be present in public spaces, including when repeated peaceful protests and complaints had been made through all available channels. So there has to be peaceful and democratic action in this regard. And let me conclude by again urging that we apply a human rights approach to this issue as we go forward, and as much complexity as possible. And I think, we really also need to be careful about avoiding too easy a sort of focusing on symbolism. As someone said to me, the replacement of historical symbols risks replacing real structural change and the addressing of grievances and discrimination. Destroying the past isn't an answer to equality or discrimination in the present. I certainly agree with that. So let us engage peacefully, democratically, and critically with heritage as a tool which can teach us about human achievements and also about the wrongs we have committed and the lies we have told about those crimes and the great need for human rights reform today. To quote David Von Drehl, who wrote in the Washington Post in June, "Destruction is easy, persuasion is difficult. The ground has shifted. The country can be persuaded to look at its past anew. Vandalism, however, will always lose the argument." Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing the remarks by my distinguished fellow speakers.
Thank you very much, Professor Karima Benounne, UN Special Rapporteur on Cultural Rights, for these interesting and insightful remarks. We will come back to a few of your points in the discussion. I'm looking very much forward to that, but we will continue with the program, and I give the proverbial floor to Professor Torstein Tollefsen, who is a professor in philosophy at the University of Oslo and also an icon painter. Professor Tollefsen will talk about the iconoclasm in the Eastern Roman Empire. Professor Tollefsen, you're on.
Thank you. Well, I'm asked to talk about the Byzantine Iconoclasm, probably because that is an incident in history which a lot of people know about, and maybe also because it gave rise to the term iconoclasm. Most Christians belong to churches that consider images an integral part of worship. And that images are an integral part of worship is in particular the attitude of the Orthodox churches. For the Orthodox, Christianity is a religion with images, and the church proclaims the gospel in word and in image. The use of symbols and images developed in the early church and culminated in the fully decorated Middle Byzantine church buildings. However, from the 730s to the middle of the 9th centuries in and around Constantinople, there was a controversy over the traditional practice. It seems that the emperors played an important part in the campaign against images. In 754, Constantine V gathered an iconoclast council that issued a definition, so-called, a statement prohibiting the making and liturgical use of icons. This definition is extant since it was quoted and refuted paragraph by paragraph at the Iconophile Council of Nicaea in 787, acknowledged as the 7th ecumenical council by the Orthodox and the Catholics. The primary object of attack for the iconoclasts was the icon of Christ. And it was argued that it is impossible to manufacture a true image of Christ. True image is a central term here. Why should that be impossible? Well, the reasons are dogmatic. Christ is God incarnate, God who became a human being. A true image should have to present the God-man essentially and truly. This was considered impossible since God is invisible and unlimited. This is, of course, a simplified version of the argument. Since a true image is impossible, the icon turned out to be an idol. And as a result of that, icons were destroyed in Byzantium. We do not know to what extent, though. And iconophiles were persecuted. And we don't know the extent of that either. The iconophiles had to answer this challenge, and in the beginning of the 9th century, St. Theodore the Studite, leader of the famous Studious monastery in Constantinople, presented his 3 treatises against those who wanted to destroy the divine images. Using Stoic and Aristotelian logic, Theodore argued philosophically for the legitimacy of the icon of Christ as well as for icons in general. His arguments are, of course, too complex to be sketched in a 10-minute presentation, but I shall make one simple point. The icon does indeed represent and present Christ, the God-man. Since God became a human being, he will definitely be visible for bodily eyes in his humanity. However, to recognize him as the God-man, one needs hermeneutical presuppositions. The icon can only be read or understood properly as what it represents for the faithful. Seeing the icon and considering it intellectually directs the attitude of the believer directly to Christ himself. According to Theodore, the icon is not so much an image of Christ as it represents or presents Christ and institutes a meeting with the Savior himself. So the icon almost becomes a living thing. This attitude towards the holy images is essential for Orthodox Christians. When the Orthodox light candles in front of the icons and kiss them, they do not worship the manufactured or material object, but in the icon or through, mainly, probably more properly to say, through the icon one meets the person that is represented in form and color. And this means, of course, that the Orthodox cannot do without icons. And just to, this is the shortest lecture I've ever given, I suppose, just to connect to one incident in recent times, in the last year. This is also the background for why Orthodox believers at the island of Lesbos found it hurting that some churches had been vandalized, probably by immigrants.
We will now move to the more nearby areas, Norway, and we welcome Professor Torkel Brekke to the camera. Brekke is professor in cultural and religious diversity at OsloMet, and he will talk about iconoclasm in Norway.
I want to look at three particular historical moments in Norway's history when the destruction of physical symbols of perceived evil became key to political activists. Very roughly, these three moments are 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, and today. Deep religious and cultural transformations are generally accompanied, or sometimes at least, by the destruction of symbols that represent the old order. And Norway has gone through a couple of fundamental religious shifts over the last millennium. And some of the most striking images that we have concerning these transformations are about the smashing of the old gods. According to the Old Norse sagas, Harald Greycloak, King of Norway in the 900s, late 900s, an early Christian ruler, worked hard to destroy pagan cult sites. More famous, of course, is the story of Olaf Haraldsson, Saint Olaf, King of Norway in the early 11th century, 1015 to 28. He had a more important role in making Christianity take root in the country. When he talked to Gudbrand and the peasants at Hundorp, he famously converted them by having their wooden idol smashed open and, quote, out crawled mice as large as cats and lizards and serpents, end of quote. So the image of the old wooden god being hacked open and animals symbolizing evil crawling out sums up in a way the victory of the new faith. By striking down symbols, people create stories about the struggle between good and evil. The next great shift in religious culture in this part of the world was, of course, the Reformation. It started in Germany and spread to Denmark in the 1520s and then to Norway in 1536. In October 1536, the newly crowned Danish king, Christian III, carried out a coup against Norway, and the country would become a vassal state under the Danes and remain so for the following 3 centuries. Destruction of Catholic images was not part of Lutheran doctrine, as it was in some other reformers, but still there were instances of Lutheran agitators attacking the symbols of the old religion in Denmark and in Norway. And I'm going to read a nice extract, I think, from a chronicle called Skibby Chronicle, a Danish text written by Paul Helgesen in Latin, probably in 1533-34. In one section of this text, there is a description of how an angry Lutheran mob destroyed the Catholic artwork in the Church of Our Lady in Copenhagen. I quote this text. In the year of the Lord 1531, on the 3rd day of Christmas, which is consecrated to the whole evangelist John, some Lutherans from Copenhagen, in the grips of incredible rage and madness, crashed into Our Lady's church, which is the largest and greatest church in the city, and desecrated it with their church robber hands. First, they overturned all the saints' pictures, spat at them, beat them with their fists, and mocked them with terrible scoldings, while destroying them with their axes. And then they pushed on into the choir, in which they completely destroyed the chairs and all the panelwork. The main altar remained unscathed, however, when the city bailiff defended it with danger to his own life, but everything else was desecrated. One even went so far as to destroy the books. End of quote. Now, these are 2 moments of deep cultural transformation. 1,000 years ago, when Norway moved from a pagan culture to Christianity, and 500 years ago, when the country went from a European Catholic culture to a Lutheran, Danish religion and culture. And the stories that stick in our minds are often about the anger with the symbols of the old culture and the desire to destroy this, often by violent means. Perhaps we are in the midst of another great cultural transformation right now. Both the passing from paganism to Christianity and then from Catholicism to Lutheranism took decades, perhaps centuries, to complete. So it's always hard to tell when one is inside a deep transformation. Now, the transformation I'm talking about now can best be captured by concepts like modernity, secularization, and not least globalization. There's no doubt that Norwegian culture has changed, is changing. There is a new visibility of religious groups and symbols other than those belonging to the majority Lutheran Church. There is new acceptance of diversity in society, and there is a new tolerance of diversity. And these are excellent developments, which mean that more people can live out, they can display and enjoy their cultural and religious heritage. At the same time, of course, this year has witnessed frustration and anger directed at what is perceived to be unjust and evil culture and social structures. The frustration and anger has been directed at monuments here in Norway, as it has been in the USA, in the UK, and in a number of other countries, as Karima just have told us about. This summer, the key debates in Norwegian mainstream and social media was about the demand to demolish several statues and monuments in Oslo, most famously probably a statue of Winston Churchill and one of the early 18th century author Ludvig Holberg. More than 5,000 people signed a petition to take down statues in Oslo because, in the words of the petitioners, these statues represent racism. Now, I have taken the time to read many of the comments made online by the signatories to this petition. And a very large part of them deal with what they see as injustice done by whites against people of color. Now, this new monument activism that we have witnessed in Norway and in a number of other places is clearly an echo of what is taking place elsewhere. I would say that local experiences here in Norway are now being interpreted in the light of powerful narratives about slavery and the relationship between blacks and whites, narratives that are being broadcast primarily from the USA. In my view, this narrative gets much of its force from a questionable presentation of world history that has gained a lot of traction lately. In this tale, world history is a great struggle between white colonizers and black and brown peoples that have been colonized. This story purports to show and explain how there emerged a global racialized social structure of the past centuries, where whites are on top and everybody else are being exploited. This narrative also claims that the global racialized social structures are replicated in most local societies so that local relationships and transaction can best be understood in light of this global history. And this is why monuments in Norway suddenly can become meaningful within a great global narrative of good and evil. Now, I think that the concept of difficult heritage can help us try to approach these conflicts and these frustrations. The concept of difficult heritage I borrowed from a sociologist called Sharon McDonald, and it's part of what is called critical heritage studies. And I think that critical heritage studies is a good place to start our discussion of what to do with these conflicts, because it tries to look critically at both patriotic depictions of cultural heritage and also the paternalist depictions of minority cultural heritage that is often presented as the alternative. And I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to our discussion with Karima and Torstein. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I start with the first question to you, Karima Benounne. Can you mention one example where destruction of cultural monuments would be the right thing to do?
I think to do so in a way would be violating what I said in the talk, which is about trying to be really complicated when one looks at this. I mean, I guess the best I could say is, if there were a democratic process in a society which adopted a decision to get rid of a particular form of heritage and perhaps to commemorate that or document that heritage in some way, then I think it could be acceptable. I mean, no one says that we have to keep everything forever. Human beings never have. But I think one would have to be very careful about thinking about who would be impacted by that destruction, what would be lost, and what history we would be failing to transmit to future generations. And certainly it would have to be done democratically and non-violently. And I think I really appreciate the last point that was made about making sure that both our sort of quote unquote patriotic narratives and our quote unquote critical narratives are examined very carefully and their assumptions are questioned is critically important and needs to be a part of any such process. So sorry if that wasn't a straightforward answer, but I think it's precisely the sort of two straightforward answers that we have to avoid now. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I was thinking about the Nazi monuments from the occupation period in Norway during the Second World War. Most of them were taken down, and so that was what I was thinking about.
Might I follow up?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry, because I think you've raised such an important example. And I was thinking about this because one of the most impactful experiences I've ever had in my life was visiting the site of Auschwitz in Poland. And I remember thinking how incredible it was that the site was simply not bulldozed afterwards because of the horror that it represents and the horror for the local community then living beside it. And yet, it is one of the most powerful tools we have for teaching anti-fascist messages today and messages about the importance of preventing genocide. And I'm not saying that applies to all Nazi monuments. There may well be instances in which a different solution is more appropriate, but that's just the example that comes to my mind. And excuse me for coming back, because I think you raised an important issue.
Thank you. And you spoke about kind of a third way, and I would like to ask Professor Tollefsen, what do you think about that? Benounne made an example from Lithuania, where more than 80 statues, I think, that communists installed around the country during the Soviet era was brought together in a park in order to be teaching visitors and future generations about the wounds of that era. What do you think about such a solution?
I suppose it could be a good solution in many respects, even though I understand why they removed all the statues of Stalin from the former Soviet territory. But there is as far as I know, there is a statue of Stalin in Gori, where he was born, and that is understandable, I think. It serves some purpose, probably. And also, of course, the destruction of other Nazi memorials in Germany and other places, statues of Hitler and so on. They should at least be removed to some place where they could be a part of an educational institution, I suppose. That is one thing, but I understand very well that I cannot be a part of the public space everywhere.
Brekke?
Just want to follow up on what Torstein said about removing, or what many people have said actually, about removing symbols that are problematic and putting them into museums. There's something that strikes me as, well, it's interesting, but maybe also a bit simplistic about that, because putting things into museums or, marking them with text explaining that could be a good idea, of course, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things are no longer dangerous. I mean, in my own work with South Asian cultural heritage, I've seen many instances where museumized artifacts in museums have also been fierce sort of objects of controversy. So there's something funny about the idea that as long as we can just put things in a museum, then they're no longer dangerous. So that's one thing. But of course, I agree in a general sense with Karima's point that what we first of all need is to have democratic processes when we decide who gets to decide, what should be in public square. And we also, I think, we also need to teach our kids and young people that a culture is complex. We need to live with complexity, and culture and cultural expressions will never be pure.
Thank you. Tollefsen?
Yeah, well, I suppose my idea was not to put them in museums in order to make them, what should I say, that they should not be offending anymore, that they should just be museum pieces in some sense. I think one solution for at least the kinds of monuments we talk about now could be museums or some particular areas like in Lithuania. But of course, they still are or should be offensive, I think. It's not to create some kind of calm or to make them neutral or something like that.
Benounne said we're a message from the past and a pathway to the future. So I guess they need to, have some of their force in the expression, even though they are a part of the history. Yeah, I have a question for you, Professor Brekke. You talked about several changes in the Norwegian cultural religious landscape. So if religion is a part of the problem, maybe, how can it be part of the solution?
I think one thing that we haven't really talked much about and that we could talk about is that on the one hand, we talk about what should be removed and what cannot have a place in the public square, but we should also talk about what monuments or what symbols do we need, what is underrepresented, what should be raised of monuments, right? And I think that there's still a lot to be talked about and discussed when it comes to indigenous peoples in this part of the world, in Norway, in the Nordic countries, and how they are represented in public space. And so it's always harder to see things that are not there, things that are lacking, sort of, and rather attack what's already there that's problematic. So I think maybe that's the way to approach that question, Ingrid.
Benounne, do you want to comment?
My apologies. I think that was actually a very comprehensive answer, in fact. And I wanted to go back to the point about things not becoming sort of simply safe because they're put in a museum space. I think that's absolutely true. And it really depends on the commentary and the analysis, and then perhaps even the layered commentary containing different interpretations of the same heritage. But that is certainly why I mentioned the point with regard to the concerns of the Belgian curator about simply the solution being to move King Leopold into a museum. That solves one problem and perhaps creates others as well. But I very much agree that we have to look at what heritage is missing, who is not being represented, where is the LGBT heritage, where is the heritage of indigenous peoples, where is the representation of a diversity of women. This is, I think, critically important in looking at what we have in public space. In fact, taking things down in some ways is the easy part. Deciding, I think, what symbols are going to represent us collectively as societies is a more complicated process, and that too requires consultation and participation. And I think brings a kind of positive dimension to the discussion, which is about creation and not just about destruction.
Brekke.
One of the things that I would have talked about if this was more of a free-for-all is, of course, my favorite case, which is India, where Karima also mentioned the important fact that there is a very active campaign by the Hindu nationalist government and its affiliates to destroy the cultural heritage of other religious traditions. And of course, we could trace this far back, but it really starts in 1992 with the famous demolition of the Babri Masjid, the mosque in Ayodhya, built by the great Mughal Babur. And the point, I think, that we can extract from events like that is that there always seems to be this really interesting dynamic relationship between politicians and facilitators, power people on the one hand, and the masses on the other hand. And I think that's it's always really good to try to analyze things often look like spontaneous outbursts of feelings, emotions, etc. But it's always really interesting to try to go behind the mechanisms and see who are really behind the ideas here, who are organizing this. And that's obviously the case in India. You have a political class trying to hide the fact that they are orchestrating the destruction of cultural heritage, and simply referring to the anger of the masses. So I'm always suspicious when I hear references to the angry masses that simply demolish things. That's one thing we need to question.
Thank you. It was also said that the easy thing is to, to take the statues down, or to, to destroy it. And of course, this has to do with power and privilege, as you said. But you said, Benounne, that it's not a human right to not be offended. But has it become a privilege?
The reason I raised this point is, of course, if we go too far in a particular direction, we run into, for example, the issue of the cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad. And I think one of the concerns that somebody raised with me when I suggested this idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission about monuments is, it plays into this sort of culture of offense that, at least in, I think, especially in English-speaking parts of the West, but not only there, we're also seeing this now in France, has become very predominant in a way which has some positive aspects of being able to raise some very legitimate historical and other ongoing grievances, but has some negative aspects because of certain kinds of victim discourses that I think are ultimately not terribly helpful in understanding the complexity of the situation that we face. So for me, it's important to make a distinction between dealing with cultural heritage that actually is either a justification or a glorification of past human rights abuses, such as the practice of slavery or systematic segregation, versus dealing with objects which may offend people for a variety of reasons, whether naked statues or images that they feel are a challenge to their religious beliefs. And of course, those are difficult distinctions to make, but I think they're absolutely essential, because what we don't want is for this process to become a process of censorship instead of a process of actually helping us to see more of and understand more of history. So that would be exactly the opposite of what we want. And one last thing I would say about this, I really appreciate this event that you're having, because one of my concerns is that there isn't a great deal of open space to talk about this. The narratives on the left and on the right are both very simple. I'm sorry to see that some, and I stress some, on the left have justified the destruction of monuments because of the content of those monuments. And some on the right have picked up on easy narratives defending statues without looking at people, right? So Donald Trump kind of rushed in to be the defender of Confederate monuments with no sort of interaction or recognition of the human meaning. And neither of these discourses do I find helpful. I think we need something much more complicated that is, as Torkel said, going to kind of analyze critically on multiple axes at the same time.
Thank you. I give Professor Brekke and also Professor Tollefsen a short minute each, and then we have to move on, unfortunately. So would you start, Brekke?
Yeah, I mean, to sum up, first of all, I think it's really hard to disentangle the religious and the political part of this discussion. I mean, it seems, if you look at history, that when somebody tries to destroy the past in some sense, or the cultural heritage of their enemies, yeah, it can be about religion, obviously, but it very often has a military and a political aspect to it. So these things are really quite intertwined, and I think that's very often the case now as well. I guess what's new is that the powerful forces of nationalism and the nation state has come into the picture, and that is a sort of a new type of player compared to earlier history. Also, what's new this year, of course, is that things have seemed to become so globalized in the way we talk about things, and the platforms on which we talk about these things, and that, of course, has to do with social media and the accelerating public or half public debates. So things are changing fast, and we researchers need to try to keep track, and that's really hard.
Thank you. Tollefsen?
There's one thing I would like to say. There is an aspect to this that we have not talked much about. That is the phenomenon that religious symbols and images are destroyed for dogmatic reasons, even though they don't represent some kind of a power structure that one attacks. But the destruction is motivated by simply by religious dogmas or whatever. Like you had in Byzantium, and what you could say that you find throughout history and also today. And that is a rather complex issue, I think, but a very important one. It does not have so much to do with historical injustices and so on. It has to do with religious attitudes which come into clash, and one destroys other religious groups' symbols or images.
Thank you. Benounne, last few words before we end.
I guess I would say, really, again, I think we need to go back in the contemporary period to a human rights approach to this. We need to look at the ways in which the heritage in question impacts the enjoyment of a range of human rights, whether it's the right to education, including the right to learn history, whether it's the right to take part in cultural life, whether it is freedom of expression or freedom of religion or belief. We need to look at whether or not the heritage in question is justifying past human rights abuses in a way that is having an impact today. And then we need to think about, through a democratic process, what the most human rights respecting responses are. And I think Torkel is absolutely right. We need to avoid generalizing about the power dynamics sort of globally and writing one version of anti-racism that may be appropriate in one context, or even there's a debate about it in that context, onto other contexts. I think I've heard a lot of complaining about this in French-speaking contexts as well, that sort of the Anglophone version of the anti-racist narrative is now the one that they are supposed to adopt, even if perhaps the sort of dynamics are very different in their own society. So I think we can learn from global experiences, but we also need to, while taking into account universal human rights, we need to apply them with respect to the specificity of diverse contexts. I think that's the most useful way to have this human rights discussion going forward. And really, thanks so much to everyone. I really appreciated the discussion.
Thank you very much, all of you. I'm sorry to cut you short, all of you. We could have been following quite a few questions, I think, in this conversation, but this is the time we have.